Well, friends, our global team of evangelists at the Great Commission Society, only speaking from our point of view as missionaries, we've been amazed and humbled to witness, conversions of people across the world, actually. We've been so blessed to be able to see this. People from religious backgrounds, different religions, people from non-religious backgrounds, people that are, traditional, people that are progressive. I'm talking about Muslims, I'm talking about Hindus, young people, old people. And what do you think has been the key to unlocking the hearts of these people? What do you think the key has been? People from such an array of cultural and religious backgrounds. Well, I got to be honest with you, but there has been no key. There has been no key at all. There's no special, unique gospel message because we've only got one. There's been no cross-cultural tool that we've used. In our evangelism, we actually do not do anything differently than we would anywhere else. What we do in the UK is the same thing that we will do in Papua, Indonesia, in the jungle. Our evangelistic methods, well, yes, they are creative, but really the methods are singularly uncreative. They're very basic. In fact, some of the most effective methods that we use are the old-fashioned methods, old-fashioned printed gospel tracts, but we make them a little bit more modern. We might use a cube with some pictures, but it's still pictures. It's all very basic. And so to suggest that some people are easier to convert to Christianity than others, I think it's actually foreign in the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible does it tell us that there's some special, simple, unique method to reach the Greeks or the Jews or the Romans. There's not. We are only given one gospel message. And, the Bible is very clear that all of us, by nature, we're born in sin. We've inherited it. And so in our evangelism, I think one of our struggles is that we must preach the gospel. We've got to pray for the seeds that we sow to grow. And we need to wait on the Spirit of God to move. That is the only solution here. There is no key into, the spiritual morgue of the world. We're living in a world that's dead in its sin. It's a morgue. And there is no key, no simple method. In many conferences and training meetings, people say, Tony, tell me, how do you share the gospel with Jehovah's Witnesses? Tony, how do you share the gospel with Muslims in Indonesia? Again, I'm sorry, but the gospel is one. There's only one message. Yes, we might be able to word things differently, make them a little bit more accessible, but ultimately there is no key other than the gospel message. However, when I say this to you, this does not mean that cultural diversity is irrelevant to our evangelism. Cultural diversity is a concept that we must be aware of. And, most of the world's cities, they're becoming more and more ethnically diverse, actually. Even if I look at where I live, well, we've got Romanians, Moldovans, Nigerians, you've got Portuguese, Chinese, Jews, people from Pakistan, India. Around the world, it's so ethnically diverse. And the world, it has 195 countries, 195 countries with thousands of ethnic subgroups that bring both challenges, but also opportunities for evangelism. And that's what I want to present to you today. I want to be able to talk to you about some of those opportunities. And we're just going to, in our short time together, look at 5 very basic lessons. 5 lessons to give a context for cross-cultural evangelism. And these are 5 lessons that I am still learning. I've been learning over the last 20 years in ministry of cross-cultural evangelism. And I really hope that you may find some of this beneficial, because in your life, in your situation, in your country, in your city, in your village, in your street, you know, you're going to have unique challenges. Everyone will be different. However, the gospel will be the same everywhere. And so, what are these 5 lessons? What is the first thing that we can try to learn about today? Well, the first point I want to present to you is understanding. Understand people's cultural backgrounds. It's terribly embarrassing, but there's a lot of arrogance in Christian ministry, where, you know, we get a little bit dogmatic sometimes. I'm sorry, I must be one of those people. You know, we know a message, we believe the message, and we share that message everywhere, and we forget to understand the people we're speaking to. I remember the Apostle Paul, you know, he was so adaptable. His knowledge of different cultures was so vast. He was able to be a Greek to the Greek, and a Jew to the Jew, and a Roman to the Roman. He was able to be like somebody under the law to somebody under the law. He was able to actually try to be in their shoes, and he shared the same gospel. Jesus Christ did the same thing. For him to come to this world to bring us the gospel, he needed to show understanding. And that is why he became a human man. He was born as a baby to be like you and me. You know, he wanted to show his solidarity, his similarity with us as humans. And I think it's very, very important to understand this. And, you know, I think that in our cross-cultural evangelism, we need to understand how someone's cultural background impacts their understanding of sin. If I speak to sin to a Mormon, their understanding would be different to when I speak to a Muslim. Their understanding of sin will be totally different. And if I speak to an atheist, again, their understanding of sin it's a world apart. And so it's interesting that Christian anthropologists, they classify cultures into 3 different sin response types. Let me share them with you. The 3 sin response types include guilt cultures, which emphasize innocence. This is most common in the Western countries. The second sin response type is shame cultures, which emphasize honor, and they're most common in Eastern countries. And then the third response type is fear cultures. And fear cultures, they emphasize power. And this is most common in tribal countries where there are tribes. Now, let me explain in more detail what am I talking about. Let us examine these 3 response types. 3 different responses to sin. The first one, let us look at guilt, innocence cultures. Now, guilt cultures, you know, Western Christians coming from a guilt culture. It's interesting, but Western Christians, we typically use legal terminology when we share the gospel. We use the words like judge, work, punishment, debt. These are legal words, actually, if you think about it. And these terms, yes, you can find them in Scripture, of course. And these words may communicate fine to other Westerners. But to the vast majority of people in the world, these metaphors, they are unhelpful, really unhelpful. So many people hardly sense personal guilt. And so they don't seek forgiveness from God. And so that's very common in Western cultures, the guilt innocence culture. and you can see the opportunity on how we can connect with people, but you can see the limitation of how Christians communicate, you know? And I think that's quite interesting to remember that. The second culture would be the shame honor cultures. Now, it's interesting, but these cultures, they rely upon community pressure to guide social behavior. And really members of these cultures, they preserve their honor and their reputation in the community. It could be the community of the village or the family. And by adhering to the group's expectations, that is how you obtain honor. And so in these cultures, they will often avoid the shame that could result in exclusion from the group. So, for example, I have friends in Southeast Asia that are Buddhists. They have Buddhist fathers and forefathers, and I've shared the gospel with them, and they really want to believe, but they cannot do it. And what's stopping them is what their father will think of them. You see, they don't want the shame. They want honor. Even though they might want to believe in Jesus, what stops them is the shame-honor problem. And it's very important that we understand this as we're trying to share the gospel with people from that culture. And it's not too difficult. We just need to use maybe different metaphors, different words, different approaches and cultures. Maybe we need to be a Buddhist to the Buddhist and a Muslim to the Muslim and a Hindu to the Hindu to be able to reach them for Christ. And, since honor and shame come from other people, that is why they are more community related in those countries. In the UK, children sometimes grow up and they leave the home and they don't care less about their families. That does not happen very often in China. In China, there's a big connection with the family, and that is influenced by the culture response. Honor and community are top values in these cultures. And it's important to remember that as you're trying to reach them with Jesus. So I would recommend that we use relational words such as mediator or disloyalty or adoption or approval. These can be used to help to explain the gospel. And all we're talking about is using slightly different words, but do not lose the meaning of the gospel. So let me give you an example. Typical points that I would incorporate when sharing the gospel to somebody from a shame culture. I would say, for example, things like, God wants to honor you. He wants to honor you as a child. Did you see the word honor? Now, in the UK, I don't think I'd use that description very often, but I would in Southeast Asia. I'd say that God's created us with glory and honor to live in his family. I might think of examples like this. Our disloyalty disrespects God. And it brings disgrace to God. We are now spiritual orphans and we are separated from our Father. Another description, Jesus' his disgraceful death covers our shame. You see, the death of Jesus was disgraceful. Now look at Muslims. Many Muslims, they refuse to believe that Jesus was crucified because it's too shameful to believe that the prophet was killed. They cannot believe it. And that is a big cultural obstacle for them. And it'll be helpful as we evangelize to know that. And so maybe we can help them understand by using different metaphors. The cross restored God's face and mediates reconciliation. We are adopted as his worthy children with a new inheritance, an inheritance from our honorable creator God. And maybe another example, to have harmony with God. And think about a Buddhist culture that thinks about harmony and balance. Well, maybe we can speak like this. To have harmony with God, you must give allegiance to Jesus only. Receive God's gracious welcome into his family and live under his name. His name. And you see, that's very important for a shame honor culture. Stop boasting in your honor and receive God's honor. You see, these are slightly different metaphors. Are you with me? And in a minute, I'm going to show you a very useful video that explains more. And finally, we've got the fear cultures. People from fear-based cultures, they believe that invisible spirits inhabit the physical world. And these spirits are responsible for most of the good and the bad things that happen to them. They work very hard to manipulate or appease the spirits so that they can be safe, so they can be successful, and so they can be happy. That's what they do in tribal cultures. It's interesting, but these magical practices that we see them doing in some of these countries, they can include many things like burning incense, or wearing an amulet, or casting a spell. And so for us as Christians, well, that's terrible, but we need to understand, why are they doing that? Because if we can understand something of why, then we can find a way to get the gospel to them. Since life is viewed as a perpetual spiritual battle, in tribes, it's not uncommon to see them with a stick or a spear or a blade or something. I was in the jungle in Papua, Indonesia, and they were very nice people. They were a cannibal community, and they all had a blade and they had a stick. And that is because they believe in a spiritual battle. And also to defend themselves against wild animals and for hunting and so on. And of course, the language and the imagery of warfare may really resonate a lot with these types of communities that are fear, power cultures. Words like deliverance. Deliverance is a good one. Words like healing, darkness. They'll understand what you mean. Protection, blessing. They can help explain how Jesus delivers us from spiritual bondage. So what are the typical points that I would use? What would I incorporate as I explain the gospel with fear, power cultures? Well, it's okay to say God is the sovereign king of everywhere. He created people to rule his entire creation and experience his spiritual blessings. But we have rebelled against God's rule, so we live in bondage to Satan. Satan is the leader of the darkness. We are weak and we are afraid. But Jesus is the warrior. He's a warrior, the ultimate warrior, who conquered the evil powers of darkness to release us from the captivity of Satan, of Satan's dominion. Jesus restores God's power and blessing to us. And, maybe you can say that, you must know Jesus to access the divine spirit. Now, you wouldn't normally use this explanation to somebody walking up and down your street. But when you're in a jungle, you need to think outside of the box, okay? I remember when I was in my first jungle where I ever ministered. Well, I know the gospel very well, but I realized I know nothing. I had to learn very quickly about this culture. What makes them think? Why do they do what they do? How can I speak to them? I was showing them pictures and they did not understand the pictures. We can say that, we must believe in Jesus alone, not rituals, not magic, because only Jesus can provide us with peace and protection. So what I want to do now is I want to pause and show you a video of a very interesting explanation of the gospel that's used it's called Back to God's Village, and I really hope you enjoy this. It's a great way to explain the gospel. So let me show this to you now, and I hope you enjoy it.
In the beginning was God. He's like an honorable elder with a grand yurt. He's like the great uncle we all wish for, powerful, respected, and always faithful. One day God created the mighty mountains, the warm sun, and fresh waters to showcase His glory. Then God made Adam and Eve, crowning them with great honor and glory. He said, "Have my authority, rule over my creation, bear my glory." They were God's children, living in God's honorable village. Even with no clothes, Adam and Eve felt no shame. Then Satan appeared and said, "Get more glory, eat the fruit, and be equal to God." But the second they tasted the fruit, their honor vanished. They felt shame. God found them hiding. "You have been disloyal children, shaming yourselves and dishonoring me." What do we humans do with disgraceful things like dirt, pigs, and outhouses? We keep them far away to preserve our dignity. So likewise God banished them. Adam was dejected. "I have no name, no glory, no family, and no honor. I have only shame." In the shameful village, Adam and Eve had children, who had us. Do you know what it means that we are descendants of Adam and Eve? Imagine if your mom was the village prostitute, or your dad defected during battle. You'd get their shame. We inherit shame, then our sin brings on more shame. So one day someone had an idea. Let's make our own honor. They created multiple groups or cultures. One said you had to wear black suits and drive Mercedes, but the other determined you have to wear orange robes and be a monk. If you maintain the group's expectations, you got some honor and status. But this honor was temporary, because it was made by humans. These group rules actually increased shame by excluding some people. Even when God selected one group to bless the other groups with honor, they boasted in their election and shunned others. When people tried to create honor for themselves, they only produced more shame. The only person who could help the honorless was God, the source and essence of honor. So God became human and entered the shameful village. Could you ever imagine a big politician with a mansion going to live in a trash dump? That was Jesus. Jesus was amazing. One time a bleeding woman snuck up and touched him, and he wasn't defiled or shamed. She was purified and dignified by Jesus. He loved and accepted everyone, regardless of their shame. Jesus spoke of a great feast, where the disgraced and dismissed were honored guests. Following Jesus, not the cultural rules, makes people acceptable and worthy. But the people living for earthly honor were threatened by this. So Jesus was arrested, mocked, whipped, spat on, and nailed upon a cross. He was covered in shame publicly. Why? Why would one perfectly honorable person be so shamed? The shame Jesus bore was not his own. He bore our shame. And then Jesus fully defeated that shame. He rose from death to glory. Jesus crossed back to God's village and got a great name and place of honor. Jesus' resurrection from the dead built a new bridge from death to life, from earth to heaven, from shame to honor. Finally, people could get what they always wanted, true and eternal honor from God. But not everyone followed Jesus to God's village. Some were content with the false honor they accumulated. A few thought their shame too great even for God, and others feared what relatives might think. But some trusted that Jesus took their shame and followed him. To them, God gave a new robe, hat, and inheritance documents. humans were back in God's village. They lived honorably ever after.
So I really hope you found that video interesting, because it tries to tackle a shame on a culture that simply would not understand the guilt culture where we come from in the West. And so I think that's quite important. And it's not definitive, it's not the only way to share, but I hope you can see how this tries to tackle some of the understanding issues. If I can now just continue. In summary about these cultures, the challenge is understand how cultures impact people's understanding of sin. Try to understand that. The second issue with cross-cultural evangelism is to contextualize the gospel. Contextualize the gospel. And this is a really interesting challenge. For evangelizing cross-culturally, we must learn to use different metaphors. I've already said that. Why? So that people can better understand the salvation of Christ. And how do metaphors work? I'd like you to think about that, please. We use metaphors to organize and explain reality. For example, consider the meaning of these metaphors that you hear. He is a rat. He is a rat. Or, she is an angel. These are metaphors. You're my sunshine. A metaphor, it borrows knowledge from something that's real and concrete to explain something that's a little bit confusing and abstract. Time is money, people say. Life is a journey. Well, metaphors are great for explaining life. Because how else could we explain the confusing abstract idea that's, about God or salvation? For many cultures, that's very difficult. We use earthly language from our everyday experiences to communicate spiritual realities. And it's good to remember that. I was lost. There's a metaphor. I was lost. God is a rock. If you think about it, well, we say these things, but we are saying metaphors. We know God's not a rock, but God is our rock. Yeah, amen. The church is a body. How you need to think about explaining that to somebody else. Metaphors, they saturate our conversation and our theology. And that is why sometimes Christians become very paralyzed when it comes to cross-cultural evangelism. It's because we are trapped in metaphors. Western Christians, we favor judicial metaphors. We use legal language to explain salvation, like a courtroom scene. God is a judge. We are guilty because we violated the law. Jesus paid our penalty and satisfied justice, and we are forgiven and of our transgressions, and now we are innocent. They're all legal language. And if you think of Christians like Augustine, Luther, and Calvin, they were educated as lawyers. And so it makes sense that they use legal imagery to communicate theological truths like law, judge, correction, sacrifice, innocence, punishment, judgment, forgiveness, payment, sacrifice, guilt, wrath, pardon. These are all legal words, actually. And but what happens when we use legal metaphors to share the gospel with someone from a tribal culture? Where there are no courts, there are no judges. That is where you need to use other biblical metaphors, that maybe are more easy to explain how we can know God. So, for evangelizing cross-culturally, we must learn to contextualize the gospel by using different metaphors. Are you with me, friends? And that way people can better understand about salvation and Christ. A third point to quickly move on to is communicate clearly. Very important. For example, Muslims are taught from childhood that God has no son. In fact, there's a Quranic verse, a surah, that says that God has no son. Hindus, they deny that there is one transcendent creator who grounds all existence and morality. They disagree with this. So whoever we're speaking to, we must define our terms. With Muslims, we need to unpack what the Bible means about God's son. Not that a father and a mother had sexual relationships and they produced a biological son. No. We need to explain it in a different way. And I've given you the example previously. For example, if you're from Albania, I could say to you, well, you are a son of Albania. But Albania did not have a wife, and yet you are still a son of Albania. You see, you can be a son without a sexual relationship creating it. Muslims, for example, they need to hear that explanation. With Hindus, we work to explain a moral universe where good and bad are defined by God's character and his will. There's no use initially talking to a Hindu about sin from Romans 3:23 perspective, or pointing people to the Son in John 3:16, because you'll explain it and now you're creating a whole set of new problems. You need to explain those things, but only first you've got to unpack the heavy concepts. Explain the foundational issues and then build on with biblical facts, which include Romans 3:23 and John 3:16. It's interesting, but Don Carson said that you need to start farther back in our evangelism to provide more of the Bible's storyline for the good news to cohere. Start farther back. So we have to unpack more of the doctrine of God, and thus of the Son, to a generation that knows nothing about the Trinity. So that is a very important concept to tackle. My friends, in the past, since the 15th of December, we've had a GCS team working in Somalia. They crossed the border through Djibouti, and they've been doing an amazing work in different villages with a number of communities. And one of our teams, they traveled there, and, they were speaking to local leaders. They were Muslim leaders. And our team, they spent most of the presentation, about 30 minutes, explaining Old Testament theology. And after explaining all of the background, they then slowly made their way to Jesus on the cross. And this is the point where we knew they would disagree, but we laid the foundation, and then we could explain the Jesus that we know. This is very important, to have clear communication. The most important thing, along with biblical literacy, and to understand people's biblical worldview. Let me move on to a fourth point very quickly. In cross-cultural evangelism, we must proclaim the gospel. James teaches us, doesn't he, that God brought us forth by the word of truth in James 1:18. So wherever we are, the agent of regeneration is biblical revelation. That is what's going to change somebody. It's the gospel. Okay? And that's the truth that we must get to when we're trying to evangelize. You must include the gospel. And that is why in our evangelism, our goal is to proclaim the whole gospel, but in language that people will understand. Be willing to step out of your culture group so you can reach another culture group. For example, I noticed in the chat somebody was asking about, well, what about homosexuals? How do we reach into homosexuals? Again, the gospel remains the same. But if those homosexuals might be from a Western culture, then that is the guideline. The guideline is, well, they might understand more of that Western culture presentation of the gospel, even though they may not agree with you. Be careful, though, of friendship evangelism. You know, this is increasing as a popular issue around the world because of the wrong impression, you know, and that it gives. You know, friends, we cannot and we should not directly and clearly... Sorry, let me help you understand what I'm saying. Friendship evangelism, it suggests that we cannot and should not directly, clearly communicate the Christian message. Rather, we should make friends and maybe drop a few hints to allude and insinuate until your friend shows openness. Sorry, but I do not see evidence of friendship evangelism anywhere in the Bible. Yes, it's an interesting term, but it undermines real evangelism. Evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel. Friendship evangelism changes the meaning. Everybody makes friends. Muslims make friends. Are they doing friendship evangelism? Please, you see, the problem with friendship evangelism is it emphasizes that we need to earn the right to speak the gospel to another person. But as a fellow evangelist of mine in the Middle East told me, there's a danger of too much friendship and too little evangelism. Please be careful. I encourage you to proclaim the gospel. You know, excessive concern about context and techniques, they tend to overshadow the command to preach the gospel. That is why so many missionaries, they've become glorified social workers. You know, they are making more friends than sharing the gospel. Be careful. And the final point I want to talk about today with cross-cultural evangelism is use the body of Christ. Use the local church in the local context. You know, whatever continent you're on, you know, the church is a gathering of people who are indwelt by God's Spirit. And they try to gather regularly to preach. Even in Somalia, our local contacts are Christians. They do not meet in churches because churches are attacked. Christians are hunted in Somalia. But there is a context that they gather, and that is still church. Remember the word church, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝑖𝑎, is gathering of people. So even if they gather under a tree, well, that's church. It's wonderful. And you know, remember what we're told in 1 Corinthians 14:25. Paul told the believers, as the secrets of their hearts are laid bare, so they will fall down and worship God, explaining God is really among you. You know, Paul expected the weekly assembly not only to build up the believers, but also to convict non-believers that were attending. It was very precious. You know, my friends, over the years, several people from many restricted countries, closed countries, closed to the gospel, they've quietly attended our meetings in those countries, like Somalia. And they've even walked into our training sessions. It's amazing. You know, during the week, and they've asked questions about Jesus. Sometimes they've been very aggressive. And or maybe in some of these countries, somebody has contacted our local missionary leader. And they've identified their religion. They've told us, yes, we're Muslims. We want to find out what you're doing. Or even in Ukraine, I remember, in Russia, there was like a KGB agent came into our meeting asking, what are you doing here? You know? And, you know, it's given us an opportunity to explain, well, we explain the gospel. We are meeting because of this. And you explain the gospel that's changed our lives. And when they hear the truth of the gospel, we've seen many people turn around. It's been wonderful. And we are always very happy to share with anybody who's after real answers and real truth. And in many of these cases, people that have been born again, they've joined with us. It's been wonderful. They've not only heard and understood the gospel, but they saw how the power of Christ changes individuals and influences communities. And they have very little in common with each other. We're so different. The only thing that is now common is Jesus. It's amazing. Black people, white people, different languages, different ages, different backgrounds, different cultures, and yet we come together under Christ. It's so wonderful, and that is the church. It's a confirming echo of the gospel, isn't it? And so, my friends, please remember that discipleship through the local church is very important. We need other believers to help in the process. Please remember, my friends, if you're going to think of a brand new culture that we did not speak about today, what is it? People that are Jedi Knights, people that are Zoroastrians, people that are homosexuals, people that are transgender community, LGBT, or whatever community group you can tell me, let me tell you something. The gospel is foreign in all cultures. It is true that multiculturalism poses great challenges for evangelism. But regardless of where we're from, what we believe, what we feel, we only have one gospel to share. Only one gospel. And that gospel message is foreign to every culture. My friends, and so please, as Christians living in a cross-cultural society, we must be centered on scriptural truth. And this will slice through all manner of cultural, religious backgrounds. Remember the 5 lessons about understand cultural backgrounds, contextualize the gospel, help people to understand it in context, communicate clearly, proclaim the gospel, and number 5, use the local church.